Welcome back to the Seedy AF podcast. I'm Jocelyn.
And I'm the Omega. We're happy to have you here for another episode where we give you all the dirty details about crafting sex scenes and discuss our personal favorites from our own games. Now let's get seedy.
In today's episode, we're addressing two questions from our team member, Mute Hazelnut. Mute Hazelnut asked, what makes a lewd scene great or bad in your opinion? And for each of you, what are your favorite lewd scenes in Prince of Suburbia and A Shot in the Dark, and why?
So as far as what makes a sex scene good or bad, well, in my opinion, you need to build things up before a sex scene occurs in these games or the visual novels. And I would assume, well, not assume, like on Lit Erotica, for example, I've read erotica on there, and yeah, when things are built up, it's much more satisfying to the reader, in my opinion, than, for example, just having a sex scene right out of the gate, or like on page 1, that's when the climax happens. It's unsatisfying, and it really kind of like tarnishes my opinion of how that whole story went, or that short erotic scene. Another thing that can really enhance the scene to make it good instead of bad is character personality. If you have strong characters and the personality stands out, that enhances things, and it makes it more satisfying to read and to actually see these things unfold. If the characters are bland, then I just can't find myself to care that much. I'd rather just skip on to the next scene. And yeah, I'll just say, without the proper build-up, there's not a whole lot of reason to care, like I was saying, about who's involved in the sex scenes. And, I really think about like a lot of the first updates, for example, if you have like a flashback, for example, in my opinion, there's not a lot of reason for players to potentially care about that because they have no idea like what's going on in the story yet, who these characters are. They're just, two human beings or whatever, essentially having sex with each other, and it's just happening. And you're like, okay, so what's next? And as I was getting at with the build-up and the writing and such, the good writing, like, it makes a world of difference for me. And if the writing is just fantastic and it flows nicely, and I honestly don't know what the special sauce is, the magical combination, but there are some writers where it's just like a page turner, like you just keep going and going, and you're like, okay, I want more, as opposed to something that's not cohesive or something that is just kind of crazy or chaotic. It's hard to follow. Then you kind of get lost in the sauce and you're not anticipating the scenes or the sex scenes before they're about to come up. And, that kind of goes right back into the build-up. If it's not satisfying build-up, then the sex scenes fall flat, in my opinion. That being said, I do recognize that there's a contingent of people who only play for the sex scenes or predominantly play for the sex scenes. So the writing is almost irrelevant to them. And that's completely fine. I have nothing against that. Different strokes for different folks. So play the way that you want to, essentially.
For me, I would say that some of the things that can make a sex scene really bad are sex scenes that read like an instruction manual. That, for me, just immediately, like, I don't see how that could be arousing for anybody to essentially read like an IKEA instruction manual that is explaining like what's going on. So when it sounds like a play-by-play, like a sports announcement play-by-play, that for me is typically like not a high quality sex scene. Another thing for me that will make a sex scene bad is if it's too contrived. As I talked about in a previous episode, there's a difference between being realistic and, breaking immersion. Obviously, when you're talking about pornography and adult content and sex scenes, it has to be contrived to a certain extent, because typically the scenarios that you're reading about or watching are not things that would happen in real life, because that would be boring. However, the writer still has to build enough of a world and enough of a reason and enough character motivation and enough, structure around it that I can immerse myself in it, even if it's something that wouldn't happen in real life. I at least have enough understanding of what the kind of rules and what is going on in that world, in that character's mind, to be, like the Omega said, cohesive and not chaotic or really inconsistent. So, that's kind of a fine line to walk, because I don't necessarily want my sex scenes to be like super realistic. In fact, this is probably a bit of a hot take, but I actually don't like sex scenes that are super realistic. I've seen it both in discussions around adult visual novels and adult games, and I've also seen it in discussions that women have about romance novels. And I will see occasionally people lamenting, like, I want more scenes where, the woman doesn't come or has a hard time orgasming, or I want more scenes where like something, embarrassing happens, like somebody farts during sex, or like, these kinds of things. Or there's definitely people that really enjoy when there's condom use in the scene, because for them, when there's no condom, it can be immersion breaking because that's something that they would never do in real life. And so, everybody has their different comfort level with how realistic they want it to be. But I think in general, most people want to err more on the side of fantasy. So I feel for people that like a more realistic scene, but I definitely err more on the side of, the whole point of fiction is that you can explore things that you wouldn't be able to explore in real life. And the whole point of things like adult visual novels or erotica is that you can explore things that you couldn't even explore with real people, because even real people porn, it would be, unethical, or it would be hard to find people to do those things, or, things that couldn't exist in real life, like furries. Like there's all kinds of, kinks and fetishes that can't exist in real life. And so to me, that's the whole point of pornography, erotica, adult games, is to lean into that. So I prefer something that leans a little bit more on fantasy and a little bit less on reality. One of the things that we laugh about is when people say things about our games like, oh, for example, like Delia's a psychologist and that's really unprofessional for her to like have sex with a patient, and it's like, well, yeah, but I mean, like, it's a porn game. So like, you knew she was going to have sex with him. Like, I understand for some people that's immersion breaking that she's being so unprofessional, but that's the world that we've created, right? Is that she's an unprofessional person and she's willing to do that. And, again, I'm always going to lean more on the side of fantasy, and that's not everybody's cup of tea, but that's just what for me makes a good sex scene, is doing something that you couldn't do in real life. That's part of the whole point of it. I agree that it's important to build anticipation, to build tension. I think almost everybody wants a certain amount of intimacy or to care about their characters. And certainly, like I said, you need some context, you need some structure. It doesn't have to be a huge amount. You can definitely have erotica and sex scenes that get down to business pretty quickly, but you need at least, a few minutes or a paragraph's worth of explanation of like what's going on and who these people are and why they're doing this and what the stakes are and why it's tense. If you don't have time to build tension with, a lot of like foreplay and anticipation, you can build tension with having high stakes in the scene. Like maybe they're in public and they're going to get caught, right? Like you can find lots of different ways to do this. Like not every sex scene has to be super long with like a ton of foreplay and build up. There are other ways to build tension and anticipation, but I agree. Any scene that essentially starts with somebody orgasming is not going to be satisfying for pretty much any human being. Another thing that I think makes a really good sex scene is when something is novel or subverts expectations. So essentially, it's something that people haven't seen before. Our brains react really positively to that, right? It helps us release dopamine when we have something that is unexpected. And so I think that ties in, obviously with sexual content, that the more novel it is and the more different it is, the more it's going to really tickle that part of a person's brain that, they're going to find it more satisfying and more erotic. And, they're going to get more interested in it because it's something different and our brains crave novelty. That said, obviously, sometimes things that are familiar can be comforting. So I think that sometimes can come down to personal preference or even just what mood you're in. Sometimes you do just kind of want to know exactly what's going to happen. There's a reason that that romance novels are extremely formulaic. Within that formula, there's infinite possibilities. So certainly every single one is different in its own way, but there's certainly something very comforting about knowing exactly what's going to happen in a general sense, or again, with character tropes, like knowing that they're a sundaer and that they're going to start off hating the main character. And then at the end, they're going to warm up to them, but they're still probably always going to be a little bit spicy. Like that's a comforting kind of structure that a lot of people crave as well. So there's definitely something to be said for sometimes you want novelty, sometimes you want something comforting and familiar. From a narrative perspective, I think that sex scenes should, they should either advance the story in some way or they should tell you something about the character. A lot of times I see both in romance writing and when I see people talking about erotica or adult visual novels, there's this kind of belief that the sex scene should be necessary to the story. Like as in, if you took that sex scene out, the story would make no sense. I think that's a pretty high standard to hold erotica to. Like the whole point of erotica is to have sex scenes. And so to create a story that depends entirely on the sex scenes, I don't think that's technically necessary. I do think that every sex scene needs to serve a purpose. The story might still be able to work without it, but certainly it should deepen the experience of the story. So even if it doesn't advance the plot in some way, it should certainly give you more information about a character or make you more interested in them or fall more in love with them or something like that. So I think that sometimes a sex scene doesn't really change anything inside of the story for those particular characters, but it can still be a rewarding experience that does something to the reader. So for me, that's my standard, is that a scene has to do one or the other. I don't hold my sex scenes to the standard of advancing the story. it's very common as well in romance and erotica writing to compare sex scenes to fight scenes, in that like you shouldn't write them like play-by-plays. You should focus on the thoughts and emotions and the stakes and the tension, and that they should be important to the story in some way or have an impact in some way. But I think about like every superhero movie. If you held every fight scene to that standard, that every single fight scene was 100% necessary and there was no way to avoid it, and if you took out that fight scene, the story would make no sense. Like, we don't hold superhero movies to that standard. So I don't hold pornography to that standard. But certainly, again, that's a bit of a hot take. Some players, it's really important to them that the sex scene be important to the story. From an adult game perspective, I think that features can really make or break a sex scene. As the Omega said, there's lots of different ways to enjoy a sex scene. Some people want more buildup. Some people want to get right down to business. That can be a personality thing or a mood thing. And so to me, it's really important that our game have features that allow players to enjoy the sex scenes in many different ways. It may come as a big surprise to players that not every player plays sex scenes the same way. I often think it's funny how a player will be like, well, this sex scene has too much blah-de-blah or not enough blah-de-blah. And it's like, well, that's how you feel. But unfortunately, this is a very individual thing and everybody's preferences are so different that there's just no way we could ever appeal to everybody. But certainly there are things that we can do that can make a scene accessible to a lot of players. So, we will always have a skip feature. We will always have a save feature. We will always have a gallery feature. So that way players can enjoy scenes in their own way. If they want to skip right to the good stuff, then that's what the skip button is for. If they just want to watch the animations, then we put a replay menu in there for you so that you can watch them. So, I think that's a way that we can try to accommodate as many different people as possible and recognize that everybody has different needs and preferences when it comes to sex scenes. Even if we can't please everybody, we can at least try to please as many people as possible, pun intended, I guess. So as far as our favorite scenes, my favorite scene in Prince of Suburbia, when I thought about this, I had kind of multiple scenes, and there was kind of two different types of scenes that were my favorite. Both Sonia and Catherine have impregnation role play scenes where they don't actually want to get pregnant, but they want to role play that they're getting pregnant. And that was a really fun thing to do because it allowed the characters to really engage in something that that they want deep down, but they can't have it because of obstacles in the story, at least not yet. And so it's a way to kind of show this is something that they really want, and that really like turns them on and is something that is like a really deep desire for them. But since it can't be actually fulfilled in the story yet, they're just going to pretend. That also, I think, serves for the player as a way to continue the tension and the anticipation of that particular storyline, because they're not actually achieving that thing, but you're getting to kind of dip your toe in the water of pretending to do it. And so, role play in general obviously gives a lot of flexibility and freedom. And I just like that specifically for both Sonia and Catherine, that, they both have kind of different feelings about wanting to get pregnant in general and the whole, kind of situation around it. But they both, get to engage in that role play and, kind of work through some of their feelings that way. The other scene that I really like in Prince of Suburbia is the scene where the MC goes over to Naomi's house after they've had a few days in a row of lewd scenes where, Naomi was really taking the lead and being very dominant. And then on the last day, the MC shows up and kind of turns the tables on her and is kind of like, no, I'm the one in charge. This is what's happening. And I just thought that was a really great character development moment for him of really the tide changing of like, I'll let you push me around sometimes. Cause I think even in that scene, it's been so long since I played and wrote it. I'm forgetting the details, but I'm pretty sure in that scene, there's a little bit of BDSM too. Like she ties him up. Is that the same scene? Yeah. So she's not going to give over control completely either, but now they both get to play a little bit and they both get to have a little bit of control. And so I like when there's like play with the power dynamics, because it just creates a lot of conflict in the scene and it makes it more interesting, and it creates tension even when there's not necessarily a lot of foreplay or anticipation. Just the changing power dynamics can create a lot of tension in the scene. And in particular, I felt like that scene was a really satisfying payoff after there being multiple scenes of her kind of taking the lead. I think for most players, it's a satisfying payoff to have him finally take the lead and, to kind of turn the tables on her.
So for me, for the favorite sex scene in Prince of Suburbia, this one's super easy. It's very much a trope, but it's just the tip sex scene with Catherine and the MC. It was a ton of fun from my perspective. not just from the sense of like actually the scene itself, but also from the perspective of a game developer, knowing that we were going to release this update to fans and that we were going to put them with such a great tease essentially for such a pivotal moment in the game, like for the character arcs, the culmination of what these landlady roommate games, what they all lead up to and what players are anticipating and expecting. I'll admit freely that it was really mean to do this, to the fans and the supporters, but it was also so much fun. And for the most part, everyone took it in stride. And I really do feel like it built up a ton of anticipation for the players and the fans waiting for the next update, even if it was difficult to be patient to wait for it.
As far as my favorite scene in A Shot in the Dark, I think that my favorite scene so far that's been released is the Delia scene with the hypnosis. It was a team effort with Mute Hazelnut, who was the main writer of that scene. I knew that I wanted something that had some kind of interesting power dynamics. Already we know that, she's in a position of authority over him, being a doctor, and he's the patient. So there's already this kind of power dynamic at play. And I thought it would be kind of interesting to play with that and have her kind of instruct him on how to take the lead, therefore kind of like subverting the expectations of the power dynamic. And, it's a little bit of kind of like topping from the bottom, like she's the one in power, but she's using that power to give him power over her. So I knew from the beginning that I wanted to do something like that. And then it was really Mute Hazelnut's expertise with psychology and with hypnosis specifically that made the scene really immersive and really unique and just really cool. It was, I knew I wanted to have those power dynamics. I didn't know exactly how I wanted that to play out or what I wanted the structure of the scene to be or how I wanted it all to work. I probably would have done it totally differently than she did it. And I loved the way that she did it where, it's very much kind of like a voiceover and she's explaining exactly what's happening. So it's a little bit like reading erotica, but then you're seeing the visuals of it playing out in the MC's mind. Visually, it was just a really fun scene to make because it was totally different than any scene that we've ever made before. It was so trippy and it was just so different than anything that we've done before in terms of the setting and the lighting, and the fact that it was inside of his mind was just something that, I had never tried to portray visually before. And, it can feel sometimes a little bit cookie cutter making lewd scenes in that a lot of them have the same elements. So this was something that just had totally different elements in terms of the art that anything that we've ever done before. So it just felt really fun and fresh and unique to make it. And of course, it was really validating to hear from players that specifically have a hypnosis kink that we did a really great job with the scene and they loved it. I'll fully admit that I didn't think about that when we were writing the scene. I obviously know that that's a potential kink that people have is hypnosis, but I wasn't thinking about them specifically when I wrote the scene. I wasn't writing it specifically for people with that kink. So it was really gratifying to hear that it did scratch the itch for players that have that kink and that they felt like we did a really good job because we definitely put a lot of effort into that scene and, trying to make it the best that we could because it was something that was just so fun to make.
And just a real quick side note there, on a personal level, like those are some of the animations that I'm most happy with in the game. I'm still learning as an animator in Daz, and I'm sure I'll never be one of the greats or anything like that, but that scene, like for whatever reason, it turned out really nicely, and I'm happy about it. So as far as my favorite scene in A Shot in the Dark, this one is related to build-up, like I was talking about before with the writing and the characters and the anticipation. A part of that's so sweet for this, but I can't really go into detail because it's not released yet, so it's going to be in Chapter 4. I'm super excited about it. I saw the scene when Jocelyn wrote it up, and I was like, oh boy, that's going to be a really good one. So I'm excited for it. I hope people really enjoy it when they end up seeing it. So to pick a sex scene that was good that I really enjoyed from A Shot in the Dark as a runner-up, I'd have to go with the Alexis and MC campus campout scene when they're in the tent. I thought the scene was really nicely done as far as like renders go and the setup and the vibe. Honestly, on a personal level, when I was dating, I could have seen myself in a situation like that. And it was really intimate. And I could just, like, I was immersed in the scene, essentially. And like I said, the characters and the conversation that they're having, it was wholesome, intimate, and I just really enjoyed it. And then as another side note, for a sex scene that I enjoyed, like, visually seeing and the writing, is the Amazon sex scene with Paloma and the MC on the patrol car. That scene was a lot of fun because it's not something that you see every day. It's novel and it's just fun to see Paloma have her dominant side come out like that and the MC is like, yes, please punish me, Paloma, So on the sub path, I am excited for the audience to widen when we end up releasing to Steam to see if there's people who really appreciate it when the MC goes down that path with Paloma.
Yeah, this is another side note, but we obviously had an episode where we talked about like whether we put our own kinks in the game, and I do think it's funny. I'm sure people won't believe me when I say this, but like neither of us is really into Femdom, and I don't know why we enjoy it so much as far as like putting it into our games. Like I get so much pleasure from like putting Femdom into our games, even though I have like it's literally not a part of my own sexuality or one of my own kinks in any way. I'm like the total opposite of a Femdom, so I don't know. I just find it really interesting that we both enjoy it so much because it definitely comes from somewhere else rather than our personal like sexual preferences. It must come from somewhere else that we enjoy it in like a story sense, or I don't know. I just find it really interesting. Like I said, I'm sure players assume that we love Femdom because we do put a lot of dominant females in our games. But it's just, I don't know. I don't know where that comes from. I'm sure a psychologist could have a field day figuring that out.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I do like strong women. So maybe I like a dominant streak in women. I don't like to be dominated. So to what you're saying, I don't particularly enjoy Femdom, especially not the extreme stuff. But I think, from what you were getting at here is, it's fun to kind of place yourself in the shoes, whether it's the dominant one like Paloma or the MC, and just kind of watch the scene unfold for something that's novel that we don't really see a whole lot of because that's not our thing.
Yeah, now that we're talking about it, I do think that part of it is the novelty in that femdom is less common than male dom, especially in this industry. So it's just something that's novel. It is fun to write the type of female character that is a dom, like a femdom. Those are just really fun characters to write because they do have really strong personalities and they are something that's kind of different than what you see out there. I think it's also just, I find it entertaining from the sense of like, it creates a lot of tension and conflict in the scene to have this kind of what would be considered like less traditional power dynamic. It adds extra tension and extra anticipation, even though I don't find that specifically like sexy per se. It just really adds to the entertainment and my enjoyment of the scene to have that kind of just different dynamic that you don't normally see.
Right. And yeah, Paloma's such a petite woman and the MC is kind of a big lug.
Yeah.
And she's just having her way with him. So yeah, it's just crazy to see, but it's fun.
Yeah, I have a lot of fun making her renders because she's so much smaller than him, and maybe it's because, I know her story, but I feel like the power just radiates out of her, even visually, even though she's so much smaller than him. Like, you can just feel that she has him in the palm of her hand. Like, it's not about size, right? It's all about personality. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just a funny thing there. Like I said, I'm sure that, I'm sure there's nothing that we could say that would convince players that we ourselves are not into femdom, but I definitely enjoy putting it into our games, and I fully intend to put it into more games because it's extremely fun to write. And because it is an underserved niche, we have some really loyal fans that really enjoy it. And so it's fun to scratch that itch for them. All right, that wraps up our episode where we explored what makes a great sex scene and we shared our favorite moments from our own games. Thank you to Mute Hazelnut for your questions.
Remember, this podcast is all about what you want to hear. Feel free to reach out if you have more questions or topics you'd like us to explore. We hope we planted some seeds with you. See you next time.
Bye.